Thanks. We have been making videotapes of these sessions, and they will be on our website, we hope. Yeah, we're going to post. Yeah, website.
Working on it.
What a mystery. Yeah. Anyway, we've been doing that. I don't think I've thanked our soup makers and salad makers for the last 3 weeks, and I really need to. So, who made soup the first week?
Me and Blair.
And Blair is now in ICU. What did you do? No, Blair couldn't be here tonight, but thank you, Karen. And she also made the salad. Who made soup and salad the second week? Frank and
Kathy Thomas.
Kathy.
Well, we made salad first week.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's right,
yeah.
okay.
Oh, the
You
first
made
week.
you made
Salad the first
Thank
week.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Frank made soup. And tonight it was Debbie and Fran. Who is it?
Karen.
And
Karen
Karen.
made
So
salad.
thank you all very much for making our victuals. Yeah, we appreciate that. Usually every year I ask how many people are playing Live Madness. We're going to the next round of 16 starting tomorrow. Anybody? No one's playing besides Karen and Linda. That's it. She's on you. It's the round of saints. You may have heard of this. This is the bracket. No one's heard of Live Madness. This is the bracket. 32 saints, and you vote every day during Lent to see. Now it's going to the saintly 16, and then the elect 8, and the faithful 4. Those who are basketball fans know the humor in this. Okay. All right. It's Elmo versus Barney today. St. Barnabas versus St. Elmo. Fire. St. Elmo's fire.
Or back.
You do get something to read about the saints. It gets less reverent as time goes on. The first time it's fairly reverent, and then the next Wednesday, each winter there's more and more kitsch, there's more and more legends. Anybody ever been to Rome? Several of you have, I know. And when you went to Rome, did you ever hear anything about St. Lawrence, who was killed by being burned to death? Anybody heard? He was held over a brazier, over a grill, and he was the one famous. They said, I remember when we went there, and they had a restaurant right across the street. And they said, well, anyway, so they said, St. Lawrence, they said, he's the one who's famous for saying, I'm done on this side. Seriously, that's supposedly his last words. Anyway, that was about as reverent as you can get about St. Lawrence. Anyway, we're glad you're here. Any suggestions before we go to our program for tonight? Anything about the meal that you would recommend? Before we go, next week we've arranged to have warm, nice weather. All right, Ann, you're on.
Long straw, and I get to introduce our guest tonight, and I'm very excited because you all know as well as I do about Koeverings. And I'm not going to take up the time to start all over and put what is in all of our advertisements because they're wonderful people. And so, Mark and Karen, welcome home. Come on in and tell us some more about your business in Mozambique. Thank you so much for coming back.
Good evening, everybody. Good to see you again. I was wondering how many would be here today, because we heard, in fact, all through the town, we heard about the festivities at St. Matthew's on Sunday. And we wondered if anybody would be in any kind of shape to show up. Congratulations to you all. It sounded like really a fine event that was held. So lovely to hear that good news. Today, we're going to continue to talk about Mozambique, but start talking a little bit about mission, particularly in our experience there. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a history. But Most people don't realize that south of the Sahara, in the middle of Africa, all the southern peoples were not Bantu. They were indigenous peoples that lived there, not what we typically think of as Africans. And the Bantu people started to move south from Niger about 100 AD and met these peoples who tend to be much smaller in stature. And the wave of immigration overtook them, and they became more and more reclusive, very similar to what happened to the European arrival into the Americas. The Native Americans gradually got smaller and smaller. Same kinds of issues. More forceful community meeting one that had less resources and overtaking them. One of the things that happened in our particular area, which is very interesting, is there's a disease called schistosomiasis, which you don't want to say 3 times if you've had a beer or 2. But it's a disease that lives in the snails of fresh water, and it gets into you when you go into the water, and it gets into your liver and causes eventually death. But it takes years and years. But what it does do is make you very lethargic, and it's endemic. They say if there's enough water to get your feet wet, it's got schistosomiasis in it, in that part of Africa. I've had it a couple of times. You just have to take 2 great big horse pills, and you're sorted. And it doesn't cause any damage as long as you treat it within a year or so. It's just when it goes on. But we had a survey done, we had a health program, I'll get to that, a little diversion, but of school children along the lakeshore, 85% infection. And it really has bad impact. Well, after the Bantu people came and inhabited all of southern Africa, and around the 9th century, the Arabs started to trade along the coast of the Indian Ocean, including Mozambique. And that's where slavery started to become an issue. There always has been slavery in almost every civilization. There was slavery going on among the African tribes as well. But what would happen is, when one tribe or nation attacked another, they would take prisoners, slaves, and incorporate them into their community. So they would marry, and they became part of society. Because polygamy is a common occurrence throughout Africa. But when the Arab traders started to come, slaves, as well as many other commodities, started to become traded for commercial purposes, bought and sold human beings, as well as lots of other things. But the introduction of the Arab traders also brought in the contact with Islam, which we'll talk a bit about later. Mozambique was a colony of Portugal. 1498. The Portuguese were there almost 500 years in power in Mozambique, almost 500 years. And you'd ask the question, what in the world did they do? 500 years, you could have done better than this. For instance, when Mozambique became independent in 1975, there were fewer than 100 college graduates in the whole of the nation. Now, how are you going to develop a country when people never had the opportunity for education? But it started with Vasco da Gama making his sail along Cape of Good Hope and on his way to India. And he stopped at a place called, what he described as Mozambique. It wasn't a name at all. It was a man. The tribal chief of this island was called Musa Imbiki. And he couldn't, Vasco da Gama had trouble pronouncing that. So he just stuck the two together and he called it Mozambique.
Like Amerigo Vespucci.
Yes. But the Portuguese, a seafaring nation, stayed along the coast and developed most of their habitations along the coast. But they brought trade They brought contact with the rest of the world. They brought Christianity, and they also brought the slave trade. This is a picture of a fort on Eagle Island and the Slave Creek, where slaves were chained, awaiting sale or imprisonment in the fort. This drawing is a very apt rendition of how slaves were taken. What would happen is tribes were contracted to go into the interior of Africa and capture slaves and bring them back to the coast. Where we lived, the majority tribe was called the Yao. And the Yao were one of the traders with the Arabs on the coast. And they would come into the interior part of Mozambique and Malawi, which was called Nyasa land at the time, Tanganyika land, Rhodesia, north and south, and get people, and this is how they would be brought back. The men would have a yoke tied to them, a hard wooden yoke in a pair, and they had to walk 600 kilometers, 360 miles to the coast. It's a very tragic story that says, as you can see, lines and lines of mango trees along all the roads. And in season, there's mango fruit to eat everywhere. Those mangoes were planted by the slaves. It was the only food they had. They ate mangoes and threw up pips as they walked. And those trees were planted along these pathways, which are now the roads, across Mozambique from the interior into the coast. I looked up the facts. In the 1800s, 1 million Mozambicans were sold to slavery. 1 million over that 100-year period. The population was less than 3 million. And 1 million people. And just think of the impact that has and so many consequences.
Where did they go? Where were they sold to?
First of all, the early plantations were in Reunion, the little island where they had sugar plantations, and Mauritius, and then later to Brazil. The Portuguese, of course, were more interested in their own colonies than anywhere else. More Angolans from the other side of the African continent went to Brazil, but Mauritius and Reunion, small islands, but with big sugar plantations. Of course, sugar was a very valuable commodity in those days. During all this time, and particularly in the middle of the slave trade, David Livingstone was making his journeys through Africa. And when he came back to the United Kingdom, he was invited to speak at major universities of Oxford and Cambridge, Dublin, and Durham. And he made an impassioned call to young people to get involved in the great opportunity that existed in Africa to bring the Christian gospel to Africa. And he was, by all accounts, a charismatic speaker and enticed hundreds of the brightest of the United Kingdom, I mean Oxford and Cambridge graduates, to join up and go off to Africa with little hope of returning as missionaries. And the University Missions to Central Africa was formed from those 4 talks in the universities. Hundreds and hundreds of men and women in the 1800s went over. And we have a history book of that. In the back, there's 20 pages of lists of names, and then a cross next to the ones who died in service. And then almost everyone in those first 10, 20, 30 years died of malaria or dysentery or something. So they really went giving all. But the first missionary bishop in the Anglican Communion, a man called Charles Frederick Mackenzie, was sent exactly where we were based, to that area, to be the bishop of the peoples of Lake Nyasa and Lower Shire River. There were no churches, so he was a bishop of no one. A missionary bishop. And the story goes, I mean, look how they dressed in those days. It's quite chic now, maybe. Like the Matrix, maybe. Except for the lamb chop. But the story goes that Mackenzie walked with a crow's ear in one hand and a rifle in the other. And he was vehemently opposed to the slave trade. And all of the first Christians were freed slaves. All of the first Christians were freed slaves. And he would, and his group, regularly get in fights, firefights with the slavers. And the rescued slaves would become their first catechumens. This is his grave. It's an amazing story. I'm reading this history book about the UMCA, and it says in there that this first bishop, 1861, in this part of Africa, was buried in Portuguese East Africa, which is now Mozambique. I said, that's my diocese. So I started asking around, does anybody know about this? Nope, never heard about it. It was 1861 after all. There's not many people left from those days. And I said, well, they say where it is. Somebody must know about it. Never heard of it. So I said, this is what you can do when you're bishop in the middle of nowhere. I said, I'm going to go find this place. It took me 2 weeks, driving around through the bush, visiting different churches. I wasn't just looking for his grave. But we found it, and this grass is about 20 feet tall. And we have cut it all down around this old gravesite. We found this old man, because we went to this little village, and because this is where we heard it was. I said, does anybody know about this gravesite? And they said, oh, ask old man Charlie down the road. So we find old man Carlos, in Portuguese. And Carlos says, yeah, I was paid by the Portuguese to maintain this place throughout the colonial days. But after independence, the new independent government didn't want to pay me, so I haven't been back since. And I said, do you think you can find it? He says, without a doubt. So we pulled out a few thousand meticais, the local currency, about $1.50. And he called his nephews and cousins, and they all came out with their bush knives, and off we went through this bush. I mean, it's really thick. It's where two rivers meet, so it's very wet in the rainy season, and lush. And it's full of what they call the monkey bean, which is a terrible little guy. It's about 2 or 3 inches long, brown in color, and it's got little hairs all over it. And the reason they call it a monkey bean is that when the sun comes out, it opens up and sends out pollen, or these little hairs stuck to it, and you start going like this. You start scratching like a monkey because it itches terribly. And so cutting through this stuff with monkey being spraying all over the place, and all of us were walking through the jungle. And finally we came across this. The stone, cross, iron cross, was laid by David Livingstone himself in 1862, and that masonry work was 150 years old. It had collapsed from the flooding, but was still otherwise intact, and a wrought iron fence. Charles Frederick Mackenzie, the first bishop, died within a year, and the mission was closed in Mozambique, and they relocated in Zanzibar on the coast. And then 20 years later, started making missionary journeys by foot across Mozambique. But I'll talk about that later. This was our cathedral on Likoma Island. The most incredible building. They say it is the biggest cathedral in the southern hemisphere. On a little tiny island in the middle of Lake Nyasa. Few people have ever heard of it, St. Peter's. It's absolutely glorious. You can see it's very ornate. And it was built, obviously, on the island, mainly with materials from Mozambique. It's a stone's throw from our coast, but it belongs to Malawi. But we were all part of the same mission in those days. And this was our cathedral in Musumba. But we're part of a bigger family. You want to introduce it? That's me. In case you forgot.
This is Ma. This is me. And in 2011, it was the 150th anniversary of the UMCA coming to this part of the world. And 26 dioceses were born out of that mission. 26. So it's northern Mozambique, everything around Lake Malawi, Tanzania, I think we even had Kenyans there. So they got the Archbishop of Canterbury to come, and we took this, just a little aside, but he was our bishop when we were in Wales, and he was the person that ordained us. So it was a very special...
His name is?
What was his name?
Archbishop
Rowan Williams. This was the Archbishop of Canterbury until when did Justin take?
3 years.
3 years ago.
So this mission grew and grew and grew, and planted dioceses all around, all of the very strongly Anglo-Catholic tradition. Just to kind of show you what we were a part of, that red line goes around the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. That was the province to which we belonged. Lishinga to Cape Town, because we were part of Cape Town, was where the presiding bishop, we call him Archbishop, resided, is the same distance, I looked it up, from Charleston to San Diego. Africa is big. It's really big, and that was all one province. 4 million Anglicans now, only 26 dioceses. So our dioceses, they are much larger.
And I was going to say, to give them a perspective, there are 2 million plus Episcopalians here and 100 dioceses.
Yeah. And the only reason we don't have more dioceses is money. Because we tried to form some more and we were squelched because we didn't have the financial resources to support it. But there are the bishops, a handsome group. I got always the tallest one in the back. And this is Manuel Ernesto, the suffragan of Niassa, who was just consecrated the year before we left. So we had 2 bishops of Niassa. And Archbishop Tabo was the one in the middle in black. Unfortunately, modern history of Mozambique is full of violence. In fact, violence for 100 years, hasn't it? From slavery to War of Independence, from 1962 to 1975. That's a photograph of the first president of Mozambique, Samora Machel, a very charismatic leader. He coined the phrase, a luta continua. Anybody ever heard the Bob Dylan song, I Want to Be in Mozambique? 60s guys. Well, anyway, a luta continua became a real African call to revolution across the continent. A luta continua. The struggle continues. The struggle goes on. Very strongly influenced by Marxist ideology. You can see the Mozambican flag has a book, not a Bible, but a book for learning, the hoe for farming, and the AK-47 for revolt, revolution. 500 years almost of colonial imposition meant, like many of the neighboring countries, but quite a bit later, because Portugal hung on to their colonies, being quite a poor country itself. In the 1930s, Salazar, a fascist, took control of Portugal and really needed to hang on to their resources. But eventually, in 1975, they became independent.
Our church is known, the Anglican Church there is known for its support at this time for independence. A lot of the Portuguese, they were focused in the north because a lot of the people who were fighting against the Portuguese were being trained in Tanzania, and so came back down along the lakeshore. And a lot of the lakeshore villages were burnt to the ground because they supported these guys. But the first bishop of Niassa, a man called Paulo Litumbi, he was bishop only, I think, 6 years, actually was a really rebellious bishop and was supporting the independence struggle. So he got captured along with several people who continue to be key members in the church there, and some who were clergy who were supporting this. And this Bishop Paulo was taken down to Maputo, and he had his legs broken. And Yeah, and he spent several years, I think 7 years, in the prison down in Maputo, and there he was baptizing people and doing his thing in the prison. We had the huge privilege of recording his story, and by this stage I think he was 80-something, and he was virtually blind, and he had kept all this information in his mind, so that we actually did 8. This is 20 years ago now. We actually did 8 little cassettes, and he basically just talked. You hardly had to prompt him. He knew all these dates and names and stories, and he'd kept it all in his mind. Yeah. Very proud of the Anglican Church's involvement in independence.
So the Roman Catholic Church had made an agreement with the Vatican, with the Portuguese government to allow Protestant missions to work in Mozambique, but only in certain areas, and they could not expand out of those areas. So Anglicans worked with Nyanjas, Presbyterians worked with the Shitswas, the Methodists worked with the Yak, and we were limited to a tribe. The idea by the Roman Catholic Church was to divide and conquer. So the Catholic Church could work everywhere, but Protestant missionaries could only work in certain areas. And all past 5th grade, all post-primary, could only be taught in a Roman Catholic institution. Protestants were not allowed to offer secondary education. And if you wanted to go to a Roman Catholic institution, you had to be baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. So it was a great limitation. So the Protestant churches were very much in favor of the independence struggle. You can imagine their surprise at independence when all church property was nationalized. All hospitals, all schools were taken by the government and said the church no longer has a role in civil society in Mozambique. And that was at independence, 75 to 77. We had 70 or 80 schools, all taken away. 20 health centers gone. And so it was a very difficult time for the Christian church. Samora Michelle, I pointed out, who had always these kind of proverbs, said, you know, you can imagine here in somewhere in one of our rural communities, when you fry fish, you fry the big ones and the little ones in the same pan. So the Roman Catholics and the Episcopalians all got fried together. Whether we were big or small didn't make any difference to him. And fried they were. Unfortunately, 2 years after independence, the war of destabilization started. And I'm sorry, this is kind of graphic photo, but I'm afraid that's what life was like. Children carrying arms. The most feared soldiers were those little guys. Because they had no consciousness of what they were doing. They hadn't developed an awareness of what it meant. And the stories, remember the story of the terrible little boy who had to...
Yeah, I think I said last week that one of the first projects we got involved with when we first went to Lushinga was, did I say this last week or was it? When we were trying to locate children who had been separated from their families because of war activity, and say the children were doing everywhere else, the other 9 provinces in Mozambique, but we, alongside the government, were doing it for our province. And apparently this whole project started when people were trying to help these child soldiers, and an American psychologist had gone there to do this. And they had done, their first project had been doing something creative, drawing or painting with children who were so traumatized that they couldn't actually speak. So they were drawing. And there was one little guy there who drew, eventually, a horrific picture of heads on poles and a burning mud hut behind him. And they eventually found out that he had been traumatized by being told by Renamo to strike the match that lit his own hut, and those were his parents' heads on poles. And so he hadn't been able to speak for whatever. Yeah, so traumatized whole generation of young people.
And this is the end of this war, the 5 years, is what we came into, and we
What we saw as being in the hands of the clergy and the bishop, you know, what you actually were doing in celebration, in a service. We had mission, which we described as what we did outside the church. A bit simplistic, because there's a lot of overlapping. But it's basically what we were doing in the community. And you'll see later how that was divided up into evangelism, church planting, development programs, and advocacy. So that it's not just evangelism, mission. People get a bit worried, ooh, I can't do that. But it was a range of things to affect community outside. And then ministry, in the last 5 years, I was the director of this part, is basically what we were doing inside. So it was all the sort of discipleship programs and the Bible study and that kind of thing. That's how we divided it up.
What this little 3 circles started to be an important thing, kind of a epiphany for us. Because what we started to recognize is these weren't things to do as much as they were relationships. And worship was our relationship with God. Ministry was our relationship with each other as brothers and sisters in the church. And mission was our relationship with everyone else. And so every time you go to work on Monday, you're a missionary. And saying that started to change how and you are doing missionary work. As a doctor or a lawyer or a mechanic, it doesn't matter. A politician. It's all our walk in faith, our relational action as members of God's church. And that was really a big change from being a list of activities to a relationship and understanding what we were as church. And then these kind of pillars around.
Yeah.
No,
You want to stop?
yeah. Go back. Became kind of the foundation pillars for our context. It'll vary on each one, but they were important for where we were at that time. Remember that this was a diocese that was bankrupt. We had $1,200 in the bank. We had 225 churches and only 18 priests, 6 of whom should have retired, 6 of whom never should have been ordained in the first place, and 6 of whom were in fit fiddle to be priests in the church. 220 congregations, 35,000 members. No money. No money at all. So what did we talk about? This church could not be run by the clergy. It was a physical impossibility. And then we started to see this, the more we said, it's also a theological foundation of who we are. All people are called to be ministers in the church in their various ways. And again, it was sort of as we came from a very hierarchical, priest-centered tradition with the Anglican Catholic Church, that everything came through Father, through Holy Father, to no mothers. And that was a huge creation of space and opportunity for so many people that we can talk a bit about next time. And then likewise the other pillars, which I think we'll develop because I can see the time. So I think I've talked too much. So next week we'd like to develop a little bit the impact this has had in church growth, where we've had over 200 churches planted, 40,000 people come to be Christians, 50 ordinations in 10 years, etc., etc. And some of the lessons we learned in trying to do that, and then, as Helen said, maybe ask some questions too, to make you start to think about your own life here in the various churches that are represented. Please.
with 220 congregations, how many different languages did that require facility in?
In
Were
those
you often
days,
translate?
yeah, in those days there were 4 or 5 languages. Now we had 12 when we left. There were 4 or 5, including Portuguese. And our prayer books, when we first went there, you know those little school books the kids get, little notebooks. Our prayer books were all handwritten in those little notebooks. Only the priests and what we call catechists or lay readers had a copy. Nobody in the pews had prayer books. They had memorized the whole liturgy. It's an oral culture. 72% of the women can't read and write anyway. Half of the congregation was women. They learned the responses. It was one of the beauties of a liturgical church is that it didn't change. And the responses were the same every week. And the responses, as you know, come from Scripture. So the people were speaking Scripture every Sunday as part of worship service. Any other questions about this?
Do you plan to go back?
To visit someday. In fact, can I put this little advertisement out there?
Absolutely.
We're planning a mission trip, not to Mozambique, unfortunately, but to South Africa, to Cape Town, in October. There's a conference called Anglicans Ablaze. Remember, Anglican means Episcopalian. There's no it's not another church. It's our church in Africa. And Anglicans Ablaze happens every 2 years. It's a mission evangelism conference run by the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, the province to which we belong. I think 2,500 people came to it last year. They're expecting many more this year. They have really great speakers and then workshops, and it's really a vibrant occasion. Tremendous worship together with a real African beat. And I've sent it around the diocese. We've got 20 names already who have shown interest of going. It's lay or ordained, it doesn't matter. We would participate in this 3-day workshop in the city of Cape Town. Now, Cape Town is probably the most beautiful city in the world. Well, maybe it's an exaggeration, but maybe not.
No, it's not.
It looks Mediterranean at the southern tip of Africa. It's absolutely gorgeous, and they produce very fine wine. Then you go on a mission with Soma, sending overseas missionaries abroad, something like that, sending organization of 3 or 4 days, probably in a local community near Cape Town. And then we expect we'd be able to do some sightseeing and some game viewing. Kruger National Park is one of the finest game parks in the world. And so that's kind of the different activities we have. So it's part work and part pleasure in one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's tough being a missionary. But if you're interested, contact Molly Bailey at the diocesan office just to put your name down for interest. There's no obligation at this point. We're still trying to come up with the costs and how many they can accommodate for us.
But we have to let them know by now.
Okay, yeah, so in the next few weeks we need to kind of solidify costs. But next week then we'd like to kind of talk a bit more about what really happened to us in terms of the church growth and some of the lessons we learned, if that seems like a good place to go. And the biggest lesson we learned is it wasn't us. I mean, one of you come back to these things and people hear about you live with no electricity for 10 years and you got shot at a few times and you escaped a massacre. And you can see it, food wasn't that great and I lost about 25 pounds. And you think, wow, aren't they amazing? We weren't. We're just normal, ordinary folks like anybody here. But it's amazing what God can do. And that's the story about what God can do if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. And that's what's exciting about it, because God is doing that already. Last week at St. Matthew's was an example of that. That's a good place to end it, John.